Today I'm talking to Julie Jansen about her new novel, Benevolence. First of all, though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from, the Wadi Wadi people, and also of the traditional owners of the Yuin Nation, where Julie is living. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Julie is a Burrabaronga woman of the Darug Nation, currently living on the South Coast. She's a celebrated playwright and poet. She's the winner of the 2016 Oodgeroo Noonuccal Prize and the 2019 Judith Wright Poetry Prize. She has two other novels published, The Crocodile Hotel, published in 2015, and The Light Horse Ghost, 2018. Benevolence was published this year in May, and welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
Could you start off by just giving us a very brief overview of Benevolence and telling us what inspired you to write it?
Okay. Before that, I'll acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Yuin people. I'm actually not on the land of the Yuin people right at this moment. I'm on the land of the Darug people, which is my people from the Hawkesbury River. I'm in between both nations at the moment. I do an acknowledgement for Yuin country, and but I can welcome you to the land of the Darug people. And I'll welcome you in Darug language, Kwaibidja, Jamna, Payala, Yanawi, which is welcome. Let's all come together and talk.
Lovely.
Okay, now you wrote me lots of questions, but they're on my phone. If I put the phone near this, it'll make a strange noise, but that's okay.
That's okay, because I'll be repeating them, so no.
Okay, all right. Look, I came to write Benevolence as a response, really, to being a researcher for a website called the History of Aboriginal Sydney. It's a huge website. And it was sponsored by University of Sydney History Department with Professor Peter Reid. Professor Peter Reid is very well known because he set up Link Up with Coral Edwards about 30 years ago now. Professor Reid is a very old friend of mine and a wonderful historian. And he employed me and a number of other Aboriginal researchers to do this research with elders and in libraries and using videos and photographs of the history of Aboriginal Sydney, which had never been done before. And it resulted in an enormous site. If no one's looked at it before and they're interested in the history of Aboriginal Sydney, they really must look at it. Anyway, after working with Peter for 5 years on that, it gave me an opportunity because I was being paid as a researcher. And I was still writing other things because I'd already written 2 novels and several poems and 10 plays before I got that job. But, you know, you have to make a living. You've got mortgages to pay. Funny about that. But you certainly don't make a living out of being a writer unless you're incredibly successful, which of course I'm not. So while I was doing all those interviews with Aboriginal people out in the western suburbs and especially up in the Blue Mountains, a lot of the stories I was being told by those elders, with their permissions, were so similar to the stories of my own family that I've got this huge sense of connection to this wider group of Darug people. There are 6,000 people who claim a Darug descendancy just living in the Blacktown region alone. So I got this sense of this much bigger picture of people who, like myself, are quite fair, but have a very strong sense of their Aboriginal history and ancestry, but don't necessarily look particularly Aboriginal and don't know a lot about their history because it gets kind of washed away in the avalanche of white history that, you know. And so I got incredibly curious about it. And also I wrote my book as a bit of a response to The Secret River by Kate Grenville, which is a wonderful book and the wonderful play, the adaptation by Andrew Bavell as well. And each time I saw that play or I read the novel, which I did several times, and I have met Kate, you know, she's an extraordinary writer, there was a big massacre of Aboriginal people at the end of the play. And the play was, you know, went off to London and big success and toured all around Australia. And every time there was that big massacre at the end, I'd sit there, I was either in Adelaide or here at Sydney Theatre Company, and I would cry and tears. And it wasn't crying for the death of the Burrabaronga people. It was crying with a kind of rage because I knew that it to be a false depiction of what happened, because it kind of gave the impression that all the Burrabaronga people were completely wiped out. So no one had to worry about them anymore because they're all gone. And I knew that to be incorrect. And so I thought, look, what can I do to kind of correct that mistake. And with all the research that I'd done, I just thought, look, someone in England or America is going to read this website and go, gee, this would make a good novel. And I thought, I'd better write the novel first. So that's how I wrote Benevolence.
Right, thank you. It's a fitting time for us to be talking, of course, because it's Reconciliation Week.
Yes.
And the theme for Reconciliation Week this year is In This Together.
Yeah.
More pertinent, I think, to benevolence is the 2019 and 2020 NAIDOC Week themes. So 2019, as you know, Voice Treaty Truth, and 2020 theme is Always Was, Always Will Be, Aboriginal land. Both themes challenged that white Australian historical narrative that you and I grew up with. And you mentioned that responding to the Secret River. Can we talk a bit about how benevolence does challenge those ideas in a bit more detail, challenge those historical narratives?
Yeah. Well, it's often very difficult to find the Aboriginal side of a story in early Australian historical depictions. They're referred to as savages or sable brethren, or basically completely left out of the story altogether in many historical novels or histories. Aboriginal people barely mentioned. I've seen films about the very first years of the colony. There's not an Aboriginal person to be seen in the entire film. And so it's like they're being written out of history, and that really gets up my, annoys me. And I just thought that if I can somehow find the voice for Mary James, who's my protagonist, and let her voice what it was like to be an Aboriginal person living in that era. Now, the main historical information I had from my starting point was the stories of my 3 times great Aboriginal grandma and my 2 times great Aboriginal grandma, who were both servants, black servants. And the history of servants in my family, I'm always getting up to, rubber wet X over something. I don't think a lot of Australian women are like that, no matter what their background is. And so I must admit, it's a really hard question, because I had to really struggle to find Mary's personality. My first drafts, I think she was a bit of a victim. And I was really very unhappy with that. And Rachel Bin Salah from Magabala Books didn't agree to do the novel, but agreed to talk to me about the novel for about 2 or 3 years. And she was extraordinary. She threw about 3 or 4 different editors at me, kind of saying, no, you can do better. She was very tenacious about making sure the novel was as good as it could be. And I have a great deal of thanks to Magabala for the amount of money and effort that they put into the novel. And I just, often novelists say when they write a novel, it's just another form of a memoir. And of course they are, because you're writing from your own heart and your own experience. And I was writing from my own family's experience. So I just knew that in my own life and my grandparents' life, etc., you had to have a strong amount of resilience and an effort to fight back in a way, and yet survive in a society where you're in the underclass. I grew up in a housing commission house in the bush in Lane Cove, or near Lane Cove, on Lane Cove River, which is now very posh. And most of those housing commission houses are gone. It looks like Toorak now, but it wasn't in my day, I can tell you that. And the idea of finding a voice of somebody who's working for white fellas is treated fairly badly, especially in the era that I've written about her, which is the 1820s, 1830s, but still has the ability to either run away when the situation gets to the point where she can't stand it, or to talk back, or to just find a way of surviving in that situation. And the word benevolence, of course, is an ironic title because of the benevolence of Governor Lachlan Macquarie when he set up the native school in Parramatta. He did that out of his sense of benevolence towards Aboriginal people, and set the school up for his wife, so his wife had something that she felt she could take little brown children and scrub them up nice and white and put them in white pinafores and be proud of them. A lot of those children came from the Appin massacre, which he ordered in 1817. And he ordered you bring back 10 Aboriginal heads from the Gundungurra people, and you also bring back some pretty children so his wife can start a school.
Mm.
So the benevolence of the starting of the school and the total horror of massacring the parents in order to get the children.
Yes. I was surprised. I didn't know that about the connection to the Appin massacre.
Yes.
With the children from the Appin massacre. Yes, that's shocking. And the other thing there, I think I kept finding the references to benevolence,
Yes.
the ironic references to benevolence throughout. And I was blown away by the fact that at the end, of course, it's Murrugan herself who is benevolent.
You think she is?
I think in a way she is, yeah. More benevolent than I would be.
Well, she doesn't do anything to save, the wicked Reverend Masters, really. Well, I think I have Bowen Bungaree, or is it one of the boys? It's funny, when you've written a novel, sometimes you can't remember what you wrote.
No, she does. She goes into the water with the boys.
Oh,
yeah.
Does she?
And then she covers the body. I know.
You have to admit that I'm 2 novels on from writing that, so that's a bit embarrassing to admit that you have to tell me what my novels are.
No, that's okay. I quite understand. I do the same thing. And the other thing I was thinking about there too was the Maria Locke story,
Yes.
which is the story that we hear
Yes.
from that
Of course.
that native school
Yeah.
sort of scenario. And that's a double-edged sword too.
Yes. Well, look, the Maria Locke story, I was very careful not, it wasn't until I was about draft number 4 that I even mentioned her name and mentioned the fact that, she was one of the girls who married and was given some land at Richmond Road, because I knew it was historically inaccurate not to mention her, but people are very possessive of their own family stories, and it is not my family story.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I would get hell rained down on my head if I kind of wrote that story in any way. So it wasn't mine to tell. So I had to find a story where there was very little evidence. So the thing about Maria Locke is that she was very famous because she had a land grant from the governor. Well, she didn't actually. Her brother had the land grant, but she acquired it, and became quite a wealthy woman in her own way, and actually had a whole lot of land at Liverpool as well. And she was quite miraculous. And someone should write that story one day as a novel, but it won't be me. Yeah, so I had to really create Mary from dust, really. I knew that my 3 times great Aboriginal grandmother was illiterate, and my 2 times great Aboriginal grandmother was illiterate, because they only ever wrote crosses on the certificate if they married, or so they never went to school. So, but I had my Mary go to the Parramatta Native School because I love the story of the Parramatta Native School, and we've got a lot of information. So sometimes when you're writing a historical novel, you have to bend the facts a little. And for a long time, my family, my Aboriginal side of the family, we thought that our Maria had been at the school, because there was a second Maria at the school called Maria Margaret. And for years we thought, oh, that's her, that's her. Oh, it always puzzled me that she couldn't read or write if she'd been to the school for several years. And I was a bit like, gee, she must have been a slow learner. And one day I was at a conference out in the western suburbs. It was actually out in Parramatta. And a lot of Darug people there, amazing people who knew their own histories. It was very exciting. And a woman appeared who'd come down from Queensland to read a paper about her 3 times great grandmother, and it was Maria Margaret, and it was nothing like the story that we had.
Right,
We realised that she was the real descendant and we were fakes. So I thought, well, no, I'm not going to get in the way of a good story. Yeah.
But I mean, that speaks volumes too about what's happened to our families, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I guess moving on from that, how important was it for you, and you've touched on this, to create that authentic historical voice? How did you go about your research? And what decisions did you have to make when you were weaving together fact and fiction?
Well, in Australia, we're very fortunate. We have fantastic librarians, and I take my hat off to librarians every day. There's essential workers as well. And if I went out to the library on the Hawkesbury, for example, out at Windsor, and you get a tremendous amount of help from a librarian if you tell them what you're looking. And they found these obscure letters written in 1870, you know, about the period in Windsor. I was very interested in Windsor because Windsor features quite largely in,
Yep.
because we knew the family came from Bushells Lagoon, which is right near Wilberforce. And it's actually a street in Wilberforce, and it's called Blacktown Road. And it was called Blacktown Road because it was the original Blacktown. It's where all the blacks lived.
Yeah.
And they lived on land, part of which had belonged to my 4 times great white grandfather, who was a convict. And he had land, and he allowed Aboriginal people to live on the land. So, and then they intermarried, and you ended up with these kind of people who were of Aboriginal descent living on the land. Anyway, that all finished about 1910. But the libraries, the New South Wales State Archives, Mitchell Library, all the kind of things that, you know, bookie type of people like me who like to research. You know, it's my great entertainment to look up family histories, or, you know, I love being in libraries, and I'm happy the rest of the world can go away. I don't mind COVID-19. Can put me in a library and leave me alone. Terrible, awfully antisocial, I know. But I managed to find her voice in a way. It was like a needle in a haystack. It's got to come from yourself and from your own heart, really. Yeah. And her language, when it is a linguistic challenge to use Darug language in the novel, and I'm guided by wonderful writers like Kim Scott in his book, you know, Dead Man Dance. He used a Noongar language a lot amongst the English, and he really made it work, and we understood what he was talking about. And a few non-Aboriginal writers have done it too. Peter Cochrane, his fantastic book, The Making of Martin Sparrow, which is a masterpiece. He uses some Aboriginal language as well. But I found at the beginning, if I had Murrigan speaking only in language, then no one, you know, it was very hard to make the readers of English understand. So I had to very quickly make her a very bright young woman who spends a lot of time studying a dictionary, and her English suddenly becomes remarkably good. Also because there's a real prejudice amongst publishers, readers, Aboriginal academics, Aboriginal people generally, to hear a kind of pidgin English. Even though we know that languages like Roper Creole are like a pidgin English, and when I spent a lot of time in the Northern Territory and taught in schools where they spoke Roper Creole, and learned it myself very quickly because it's just it's a pidgin English really. And but there is a feeling that it denigrates Aboriginal people to use that kind of language. But in a couple of my characters, like Granny Wiring, for example, she has to speak like that because I can't imagine Granny speaking in any other way. I very quickly have Mary speaking fluent English, but and that was really a request from Rachel Bin Salah from Magabala.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And you mentioned before historian Peter Reid's work.
Yes.
On Indigenous landscapes. Also Paul Irish's Hidden in Plain View.
Yes. Yes.
Another book about the survival of the Aboriginal people
Yes.
in coastal Sydney. Both those historians contest the idea of the absence of Aboriginal peoples from the landscape. While I was reading Benevolence, I kept rushing to the laptop to look up maps to find out. And
Good on you. You got my map at the beginning. I insisted on the map at the beginning. I love that map. Look, I love it.
And I missed that. I didn't realise till the end that, you know, I'd forgotten about it
the whole time. My idea was that whenever you came across something in the novel, you quickly go back to the novel at the front. You'd know exactly. You could even use a little pencil and trace where she was going.
Well, it was just as good, actually, or just as fun for me using Google Maps because I could get in close.
Yes,
following the river up to Broken Bay, and
wonderful.
That was great. Yes.
Yeah, I should have thought of that. I kept going there.
Right.
A car and boat.
I learned that trick when I was writing about my convict great grandfather's roots in England.
Oh, good.
So, yeah.
Mind you, my husband, Michael, is a very supportive, fantastic man. And he often takes me, if he says, oh, what do you want to do for your birthday? And I say, oh, you know what I want to do. And he says, oh, all right. And he takes me out to the Hawkesbury River and we stay somewhere and we walk up convict tracks and we walk along the the bush, or go for bushwalks or walk along the river. It was very important to go to the different places that Mary had been, because simple things like the river at Spencer, etc., just past Spencer, just past Wiseman's Ferry, it gets quite narrow. And I realised I've got her in a canoe there. Now, I've canoed from Gentleman's Halt to Spencer because the river gets quite wide there. But I didn't realise kind of how kind of mangrove and narrow it was, and in other places. So to actually walk along the river with him was very important. So, yeah.
Yeah. And also to sort of think about the changes that have occurred over time.
Yes.
I struck that with writing about my great-grandmother. My heritage is Gamilaroi, and you know, the changes up there are just amazing.
Exactly.
Horrendous, actually. Yeah, so that landscape, that was a huge part of the novel for me.
And I have another interviewer said to me, and Julie, you know, your book is, first of all, she said it's got lots of sex, and I said, no, it hasn't. And then she said, and it's got lots of botanicals. And I said, what on earth are you talking about? And she said, look, I'll open any page and there'll be a description of botanicals. And she started to open pages, and I'm like, I can't even remember doing that. But she's right. And I said, well, you've got to fill the book with something.
Yeah, but that's great. That you know, that description, the landscape description, you know, that just adds another layer. That's great. In that Writing New South Wales interview, you also spoke about non-Aboriginal Australians questioning your Aboriginality because of your fairness.
Yeah.
The situation that I experience as well, I can relate to. And in the novel, of course, Murruging worries about whether and where she belongs. So why was it important to write about identity through Murruging?
Well, I think for people like us, it is a big question. And because I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, when people like my father didn't identify, even though Dad looked like Adam Goodes and certainly behaved like an Aboriginal man every day of his life, he never said those words because it was impossible for him to do so. He would have lost his job just to begin with. He ended up being an officer in the fire brigade, which is a miracle because he only went to school for 5 years. He didn't even wear shoes till he was 8 and left school at 13. So God knows how he ended up being an officer. He must have paid someone off or something. I don't know. But we always knew, but you didn't talk about it. And so it wasn't until I finished university and I decided to go and live in some Aboriginal communities, those questions really begin to haunt me and for me to want to know, to find out what the connection was. But it took years for me to identify, because as many Aboriginal acquaintances and friends of mine said, you can't sit on the fence. You either are or you aren't. And if you are, you decide you're going to identify your Aboriginal heritage, then you've got to do it with a whole heart and basically spend the rest of your life making sure that you work for Aboriginal rights. Well, I'd already been doing that anyway, you know, ever since I was 20. I immediately went to work in remote communities, and I've always worked in Aboriginal education. And so that was kind of a turning point for me, you know, seeing as it was already the way that I lived. The next point was to acknowledge that. But it's a big question for people. And a tricky one, because often you'll find members of your family that don't want that interpretation of their history and are embarrassed by it or angry by it. I mean, my mother says, and God bless her, I love her, she's still alive, 90, and she's a darling, an absolute darling, very supportive. But she just simply says, well, if I'd known he was Aboriginal, I would never have married him. You know, which makes me go, well, what does that make me? You know, kind of does my head in.
Yeah, I can relate to that. We definitely need to have a coffee. And we've talked about the inclusion of Darug language in the novel. How about the creative process? Any particular challenges in the general creative process?
There are always challenges, aren't there? When I first had the first report from Magabala by a person, it'd be a prominent Aboriginal academic. I don't know who it was, but I've got a few ideas, but I won't say. And look, honestly, any younger writer, inexperienced writer, mostly would never have written again. It was so harsh. And I read it and I just cried. It accused me of being a racist, sexist. It was so difficult. But, you know, if you're going to be a writer, and I started being a playwright when I was in my 30s, if you're going to be a writer, you have to get a thick skin. You know, I'm about to get a review in the Sydney Morning Herald next week or something, and the guy who wrote it, Jason Steger, rang me up to talk to me about getting a photo. And at the very brief conversation, he's a very kind of snooty Englishman, and he said, "Of course, it is a review." And I said, "Oh, yeah, you know, thank you," like, you know, grovelling for, you know, crumbs off the table of greatness. And he said, "It's not altogether negative." That's all he had to say, which I got off the phone. I went, what? Why even tell me that? You know, it's just, it's like, so of course every Saturday I go and get the paper and I dread opening up the Spectrum, you know, to put, you know, dreadful novel by Fool, or, you know, and there in the Sydney Morning Herald for everyone to read. No, it's a challenge to find the voice, but I think if you're lucky enough to have some good people beside you, it's easier. And look, when I first wrote the first few drafts, I had a fair kind of erotic scenes in it, and it's always worthwhile paying yourself for a really good editor. One of my really good editors said, "Julie, I think you've invented a new genre. It's called Aboriginal historical fiction erotica." I don't know if I like the thought of that. So I wiped all those scenes out completely. So there was nothing. And I felt much better about it, you know. And then Rachel Bensalara, the last time I rewrote the novel, she said, "There's no scene where the Reverend and Mary get together, so how come there's a baby? You have to write that scene." And I said, "Oh, can't we just draw the curtains?" You know, I was being terribly kind of polite and, you know, thinking of the book being, you know, on the HSC syllabus and, you know, and she said, no, you need that scene, you need it. And I thought, "I'll give you a sex scene." Sent it off and they said, "All right, that'll do."
Yeah, sex scenes are fun.
Oh, I know, but the trouble is, look, it's because they're such a small part of what I do, you know. But and in the end, if there's too many of them or something, or they're too vivid, what happens is, you know, blokes sidle up to you and kind of, even though here I am, I'm a respectable married grandmother, they'll sidle up to you and kind of lean up against you with this kind of lascivious look on their face, and they go, "Well, I really enjoyed page 57. Might be more like that." You can imagine if the pages are sticky.
I'm imagining trench coats.
Just kind of, please. I said, about my book, The Crocodile Hotel, I go into a pub sometimes in Moruya and the publican always shouts out, "There's the woman who writes the sexy books." I always shout back, "They were about land rights."
Oh dear. Well, this sort of really brings us to another question that I had about the humour in the book.
Yes.
There is a lot of humour.
They're good. I'm glad you tell me what pages they're on.
and I mean, I just think that's part of Aboriginal people, the humour.
Oh, God, yeah. And yeah. Well, I'm writing another novel at the moment called Wilga, which is a contemporary novel. And the protagonist is a woman kind of in our age group, or she's actually in her 50s. I imagine I'm in my 50s, if only I was. That Halison era. And she's based on many Aboriginal friends and aunties that I've had over the years, with a shockingly dirty sense of humour and hilarious kind of view of life for those kind of reasons. And it's one of the highlights of my relationships with, you know, Aboriginal mature women. It's a great sense of humour, just raw with laughter, and often the non-Aboriginal people around you are just looking at you somewhat bemused at this kind of, can't work out why you think something so hilariously funny. It's like me telling the story of me flashing the children. You know, I think that's funny, and other people are like, "Oh dear, why are you telling us about that?" I just think, oh God, lighten up, for God's sake. Yeah.
And I think that
there's some humour
that
in
links with the idea of Murugan not being a victim.
No, that's right. But also her friend Mercy,
Yes.
I gave Mercy, I mean, Mercy's the naughty older sister I never had. I don't have any sisters. I've got a very nice sister-in-law, but I don't have any blood sisters. And I always wanted one, that older, really wild, naughty sister. And in researching my family history, my great-grandmother had a sister who was in and out of girls' homes and was always in trouble with boys up in Windsor Park, being found down by the pub and everything. I thought, gee, I think my next book I'm going to write about her.
She sounds like a good character, yeah.
It's a bit outrageous, and doesn't give a damn what people think. That's why I have Mercy. There's some comic scenes where Mercy goes back to Reverend Master's house, and quickly followed by Mary being quite bewildered as she's going there, and she finds Mercy in the barn, on top of the butler. And I love writing those guys.
Yeah, that was good.
Mary running for her life, and Mercy's going, no, wait, come back later. Dreadful, shocking.
Well, we've come to the end of the questions, but is there anything else that you'd like to talk about the novel?
Let me see. I think it's been very important to me to rewrite histories. I lived for many years. I'm moving to Moruya. Well, I'm nearly in Moruya now. I lived on the Northern Beaches. And the Northern Beaches, they never fly the Aboriginal flag. I fought with a group called the Budua Group for the 6 years with the Pittwater Council, when it was Pittwater Council, to get Aboriginal signage in this area. And all we were just faced with a dead cold wall of no. Now that it's a combined, there's a new mayor now of the combined Northern Beaches Council called Michael Regan, who's a much more generous, I shouldn't say the word generous, fair, person. And he's encouraged the idea that there'll be Aboriginal signage, and there will be. There have been a few problems along the way, which I won't go into, but eventually there will be Aboriginal signage here. And the notion of rewriting this landscape all over Australia, and the same goes for a town like Moruya. I'll have to begin that battle when I get down there, alongside Yuin people, that there's not enough Aboriginal signage. And once again, the library there in, say, Moruya, for example, put up this extraordinary and wonderfully well-researched display of Aboriginal historical information from the elders. And I just looked at it and tears came to my eyes, because it's the kind of research I've done here for the Northern Beaches. The elders there have already done all that work, but it's just and it was handed out and forgotten. No, it should have been a great big permanent display there in the library or outside the council chambers for people to see, because we need to understand that history and not just be blinded by it and just think, Europeans brought, civilization to Australia and the Aborigines just all died. It was nice of them, wasn't it?
Yeah. Wonderful.
There's a political, I always think as a writer, if you don't have any politics, people say, oh, why don't you write, chick lit or something? And I just think, why? There's got to be a political reason behind everything I write. And, well, my dad was in the Communist Party. We grew up with politics around the table every day. You'd have a glass of beer, a plate of stew, a piece of bread and butter, and politics coming out of his mouth every single night. Dad was in the union movement, and a lot of Aboriginal men were in the union movement. That's where they got acceptance.
Yes.
And so I just grew up with it. Politics was first and foremost in your thought. And some of my non-Aboriginal friends find that kind of strange or something.
I think you've just struck a nerve there with sitting around the table. That was my family situation too. My father was the Aboriginal member of my family, and again, it wasn't talked about, but he was the one who got us talking around the table.
Yeah.
When I came to write about his story, his family story, I found that I knew, when I researched the information, I knew all the places that were important in our country, because he talked about them around the table.
Yeah.
So in a way, culture can be passed on. Some elements of culture can be passed on.
Yeah. And where did his family come from?
From Garra, from up between Moree and Mangudai.
I know Rocky Creek. There was a big Aboriginal community there at Terry Hi. I've been up there. That's, yeah, a lot of massacres up there.
Yes, yes, there were.
Huge number. Waterloo Creek. Yeah. You need to write that.
I have, yeah. I have. I'm just working on getting it published now.
I look forward to reading it.
Thank you. And I enjoyed Benevolence.
Good,
and I've enjoyed our talk. And
yes.
We'll have to have that cup of coffee, I think.
Well, you know, when all this COVID-19 things dies down, it'd be lovely to have a cup of coffee. I mean, I'll drive down. Where are you? What town are you in?
I'm in Thirroul, so just north of Wollongong. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we pass through Thirroul from time to time. We'll come and have a cup of coffee.
We'll get something organised. Lovely.
Lovely to meet you, Judy. Thanks
You
so
too,
much
Julie.
for a lovely, intelligent interview. I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.